Welcome. You've joined us today for Reporting in a Time of War, a conversation with New York Times Jerusalem correspondent Isabel Kershner. I'm Rebecca Goldbert, Executive Director of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies at UC Berkeley. We are in the fourth week since the Hamas massacre of Israeli civilians and the start of the Israel-Hamas war. This has been and continues to be an extremely challenging period for all of us here at the Helen Diller Institute, as it has for many on our campus, in our community, and around the world. In this difficult moment, our students have expressed a critical need for learning and community. Our staff and faculty are working intensely on new ways to offer deep support for our students, creating daily opportunities for students, staff, and faculty to come together. This intense need for learning and community has not diminished. As the past week since the Hamas massacre and the escalating Israel-Hamas war have evidenced, polarization on college campuses is more severe than ever. It can be challenging for students to find spaces for complex and nuanced thinking and for respectful dialogue. The Helen Diller Institute is committed to restoring civil discourse, creating forums where students and the wider community can thoughtfully exchange ideas on complicated, deep-seated subjects. In our public programming, we have been thinking hard about the critical voices and programs needed at this time. 2 weeks ago, Times of Israel senior analyst Haviv Reddick-Gur joined Professor Ken Bamberger for an emergency briefing. Last week, the writer and psychologist Ayelet Gunder-Goshen spoke with Professor Dina Aronoff about her role as an emergency mental health worker, counseling the survivors of the Hamas attack. Today, New York Times Jerusalem correspondent Isabel Kershner and Stanford journalism professor Janine Zacharia will explore this unprecedented moment in Israeli history and society, grappling with the questions it raises for Israelis and their future. Like Ayelet Gunder-Goshen, Isabel Kershner cannot leave Israel due to the critical need for her reporting on the ground. Next week, on November 7th, we will host a virtual webinar with Haifa University professor Ehud Eran and Professor Ron Hassner on geopolitics, military strategy, and the Israel-Hamas war. You will find recordings of all of these events on our website after the events have concluded. At the Helen Diller Institute, we are entirely supported by our community, and we express our gratitude for the continued support of our donors. Please take a look at our website in the chat for more information on our mission, our work, and how you can support programs like these. Today's program, Reporting in a Time of War, a conversation with New York Times Jerusalem correspondent Isabel Kershner, is co-sponsored by the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. I am pleased to introduce our moderator, Janine Zacharia, and our speaker, Isabel Kershner. Janine Zacharia has reported on Israel, the Middle East, and U.S. foreign policy for close to 2 decades, including stints as Jerusalem bureau chief for the Washington Post, chief diplomatic correspondent for Bloomberg News, Washington bureau chief for the Jerusalem Post, and Jerusalem correspondent for Reuters. She is now the Carlos Kelly McClatchy Lecturer at Stanford University, where she teaches nuts and bolts journalism skills and how to understand the changing news environment. She writes regularly about foreign affairs, the intersection of technology and national security, and media trends for the San Francisco Chronicle, Slate.com, and other news outlets. Isabel Kershner is a correspondent in Jerusalem for the New York Times, covering Israeli and Palestinian politics and society, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and diplomatic efforts to resolve it. Since joining the Times Jerusalem Bureau in 2007, she has covered Israel's wars with Gaza, the failed efforts at peacemaking, and the often fraught internal divisions and culture wars that shape the lives of Israelis and Palestinians. A fluent Hebrew speaker with working Arabic, she has been reporting on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian divide since 1990, previously working for the Jerusalem Report magazine. She is the author of The Land of Hope and Fear, Israel's Battle for Its Inner Soul, and Barrier, the Seam of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. Please welcome Janine and Isabel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for this opportunity to chat with my old dear friend, Isabel, and my colleague, and the one part of my bio that you didn't mention was that Isabel and I met in 1995, 28 years ago, when I was an intern at the Jerusalem Report magazine. And thanks to Hirsch Goodman, I later became a correspondent for the magazine, which really launched me on my own career covering the conflict. So it's really good to see you, Isabel. And I wish, of course, we could be together in person. I want to give everybody, I know people are probably eagerly awaiting your analysis of the latest in the conflict. People are going to want to hear a discussion of the challenges of covering this conflict. And I want to talk about, while we do this, your amazing book, The Land of Hope and Fear, Israel's Battle for Its Inner Soul, which came out just recently. But before we do any of that, I just want to ask you how you're doing, because I know that covering this for 4 weeks, as it's been, is a very intense experience. So how are you?
Well, thank you for asking, Janine. And thank you all. It's really a great opportunity to be able to speak to you tonight. How am I? It's a question that we all ask each other here, and nobody knows the answer. You meet people and your natural response is, "Hi, how are you?" And then people look at you and say, like everyone, we're going through something here that, as you've both noted, is just unprecedented. The pace of events, the scale of events, the country is still stunned. I think a lot of people are almost numb and haven't really had the space and time to even absorb what's happened, particularly because the October the 7th massacre has kind of rolled out slowly. You know, in the initial chaos, nobody even knew the scale of it. Nobody knew what had happened. And it's taken weeks, and there are still missing people, and there are still bodies being found. And there are 240 hostages now in Gaza, and the numbers keep going up. So this is a kind of rolling event, which, you know, it's difficult to get your mind around in any way. We haven't had a day of national mourning, despite the fact that 1,400 plus people were killed, because we went straight into war. And we are still burying the dead from October the 7th. And now, of course, we're beginning to see soldiers coming in body bags from Gaza. So the question of how I am proportionate to what other people in this country are going through, I'm fine. I'm intact, and my family's intact, and, you know, you count your lucky stars. But really, nobody here is okay.
You know, I just remember from covering a lot of different periods of tragedy and intense conflict over the years there. And the way I dealt with it was I threw myself into the work. I'm doing that to a certain extent now from Stanford. Talk about when it first started happening on October 7th, how you had to process what was happening, but then also you writing for the New York Times and you need to mobilize in a work mode. How did that unfold for you?
Well, October the 7th, it was a Saturday. It happened to be my Saturday. We alternate weekends in the bureau, and I was on duty that Saturday for news. I'd gone to bed after a quiet Friday, you know, not really expecting anything major, and got a phone call at 7:30 in the morning from a colleague who had spent the night with her parents in Tel Aviv. And she said, "Do you know what's going on?" And I immediately jumped out of bed, as journalists do, and said, "I have no idea what's going on. I was asleep." She said, "There's a massive missile attack going on. You know, sirens going off all over the country." So I said, "Okay, thanks for telling me." Got up, switched on the TV, got my laptop geared up, wrote to the desk. We're now a 24-hour news operation at the New York Times. So 7:30 in the morning, our time, obviously New York is not in action, and you begin to deal at that hour with our hub in Seoul in Korea, South Korea, where we have a news hub, and alert the editors there's something going on. I'm going to start writing. I don't really know what it is yet. I'm in my pajamas, you know, and as I start writing something that, you know, they're watching TV, there are rocket attacks coming out of Gaza at a crazy, intense rate. Suddenly sirens start going off in Jerusalem, which is relatively rare, has become less so in the last 3 weeks. So, you know, I start wondering where my kids are. One of them had been out at an all-night party, luckily not the one at Re'im, but another one in the Jerusalem hills. And he saw a rocket landing on the next hillside. But yeah, you're just in crazy work mode at that point, because, you know, digital journalism, as you know well, is instant. And so I'm watching TV, reporting on the rocket attacks as some kind of unexpected, surprise, intense, you know, incomprehensible attack. You know, where had this come from? There'd been no build-up. There'd been no rioting at Al-Aqsa. There'd been no police raid at Al-Aqsa. You know, there was nothing ostensibly to trigger this. And while I'm watching TV and writing, I suddenly start seeing the first grainy images coming through of gunmen in white pickup trucks. You know, there was one, and then there was another filmed in Sderot, and pictures of paragliders with, you know, people coming, a couple of paragliders, and you don't know if this is authentic, if this is verified or not. You don't know what it is you're watching. The TV anchors didn't know what it was either. They're sort of saying these pictures are coming through, we're not quite sure what they mean. So, you know, you're at the same time watching incredulously and trying to be careful. But as soon as it became clear that there had been a breach of the border, we were in a whole different event. And as the day went on, it just became more and more and more incredible what was happening, in a bad way. You know, the reports started coming through of breaches of the fence all along, and incursions all along, and whole kibbutzim under attack. The streets of Sderot being a battleground. It was just something very extraordinary. We still didn't really understand the scale. And by the afternoon, when I could take a breather from typing, I began to try and call people in the South. So I pulled up an old list I had of residents of the Gaza envelope from previous conflicts and started calling them, not really understanding the situation down there at that point. I'm calling and people aren't answering their phones. One woman answered and she said, I'm not there, I'm not at the kibbutz, I'm away for the weekend and I can't get hold of my family and I don't know what's going on, and goodbye. I called another one and she picked up the phone and I said, hello, my name is Isabel Kershner, I'm a reporter for the, and as soon as she heard the word reporter, she just said, no, and put the phone down in a terrified voice. And I suddenly, you know, started hearing on TV, people were calling in from the border communities to the journalists, the Israeli journalists who are in the studios and reporting live. People were calling them, begging for help, saying, we're in our safe room, there are terrorists outside the window, They're setting fire to our house. Where's the army? There's nobody here. We need help. And I suddenly realized, I'm calling these people who are, I don't even know if they're alive, some of them who aren't answering their phones. I managed to get through to one older couple in their 90s in Sderot. They were the only people that answered their phones and could speak to me. And they were sitting in Sderot with their doors locked, watching TV, and, watching a gun battle that was going on about 150 yards down the road. It was just very, very mind-blowing what was going on. But as I said, even by the end of the day, nobody here, including myself, had a clue about the scale of what had happened. It took many hours for the army to really be able to get down there, largely because, there wasn't a big deployment along the border. This was a complete surprise. Israel was caught completely off guard. And the soldiers that were there had been overrun. Their bases had been overrun by the Hamas gunmen. Those are the first places they aimed for, to make sure that there wouldn't be forces on the ground to protect the civilians. It was a very, very finely orchestrated, multi-pronged assault, the likes of which nobody here had ever imagined. People had spoken about breaches of the border and attempts possibly to take over one community. By the end of the day, people just couldn't believe it. 22 communities had been seized by Hamas, and 8 army bases, the city of Sderot, Ofakim, and Israel was battling for 2 days to regain control.
No, and I remember, as I was monitoring Israeli television, there were still people calling in 2 days in, 48 hours, that were still, where's the army? So I think that was shocking. I want to come back, Isabel, to some of these challenges of reporting on this now that the Times has ramped up, obviously, and it's not just you having to call down there. You've got a whole team there helping, reinforcements.
I must say, by a couple of hours in, the bureau kicked in. I wasn't alone. And then by the next day, we got backup flying in, and I don't want to give the impression I was handling it all alone, but that was just a taste of how the day unfolded.
One of the things that's been most striking to me is, having covered all these tragedies like you since the 95 assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. I remember when those 2 Israeli military helicopters collided in 1997, and you had 73 soldiers who were killed. The second Lebanon war, both intifadas, all of it. And every time Israelis would rally around their leaders, Israel Chazaka, Israel strong, you would hear it on the radios. And that isn't happening this time. And one of the things you wrote in a piece, I think it was October 15th, that this whole crisis is happening amid a total breakdown of trust between the citizens and the state of Israel, and a collapse of everything Israelis believed in and relied on. So just talk about that, the magnitude and how that's playing out.
Well, we're now November the 1st, 2023. Exactly a year ago to the day, we had an election here. And it was the 5th election within 4 years. And that was because Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is on trial on charges of corruption and has been a polarizing figure increasingly in recent years, had refused to step aside and just went through election and election and election until he could win, until he could put together a majority government. And the government he put together ended up being the most far-right, ultra-nationalist and religiously conservative government this country has ever had. When we talk about Israel being caught off guard 3 weeks ago, for the first months of this year, In fact, up until October the 7th, you would have had the impression here that the government's biggest enemy was the Attorney General and the Supreme Court. You know, they began this judicial overhaul plan, which was extremely divisive. We had a protest movement, also the likes of which Israel had never seen, week after week after week. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Israelis coming out against the judicial overhaul, and some similarly large protests in favor and supporting the government plan. And the country was more divided than people remembered. It was the biggest internal crisis Israel had known. And as part of that, you had a huge movement of reservists, military veterans and military reservists who were still volunteering for the Israeli army, the IDF, who came out and led by the pilots, who are, of course, the creme de la creme. And the Air Force here is very dependent on its reservists. And they usually are working overtime whenever there's, you know, what we call the war between the wars of the continuing campaign we've seen against proxies of Iran in Syrian territory, for example, the various rounds of conflict with Gaza. The last two were with Islamic Jihad. And the pilots and many other reservists in their wake said, you know, this judicial overhaul, if it continues, is essentially undermining the democracy that we signed up for. And the government is breaking its covenant with the citizens, and we are no longer willing to serve. So you had this massive movement of thousands, 10,000 of reservists saying we're not going to volunteer anymore. You know, and this is just like in this summer. So we were coming into this war as a result of October the 7th, amid tumult, you know, a very tumultuous situation within Israeli society. Now, what we've seen is the country immediately pulling together in the face of an evil that nobody could have imagined before. And the reservists immediately reported for duty. The army called up 360,000 within a week, and have been oversubscribed, they say. Some units, they've had like 150% response. You saw the plane loads of Israelis flying back from abroad to fight this war of no choice that has been forced upon Israel. And there's a veneer, I would say now, of unity. You see Israelis across the spectrum volunteering, serving, back in their army units, which are very often real cross sections of large parts of Israeli society, obviously not all. And there is a feeling of, you know, we're all in this together. This is almost existential. Not that Hamas militarily presents an existential threat to Israel's existence, but the Israeli sense of security has been shattered. And most Israelis feel they cannot live anymore with that kind of Hamas on its borders. So we've seen 150,000 Israelis having to leave their homes in the Gaza area and in the north, along the northern border, and are now in hotels. Nobody knows when they will be able to go back. Many have nowhere to go back to. And, you know, the situation is very much one now of having to just pull together to get through this terrible war. which is terrible on both sides. But below the surface, all those divisions, all that polarization, it's not gone away, and it's not going to go away. You're already hearing, the sort of blame game of why did this happen? Whose fault was it? Many liberal Israelis will say, the government is incompetent and had its eye off the ball and was just busying itself for the last year with everything that was not important and not necessary. This judicial overhaul plan has been the ruination. And from the right, you're beginning to hear, well, it's because of all you lefty reservists threatening not to serve. You made the enemy think we were weak, and they took the opportunity, and it's because of Oslo, and it's because of the disengagement from Gaza in 2005. It's not gone anywhere. And if anything, I think the rifts will just grow. Netanyahu himself and the government he formed has proven to be incompetent in the face of what has happened. The government for weeks was just paralyzed. We were just listening now on the 8 o'clock news to a woman who's involved in, coordinating things at a national level. And she said there isn't even a list anywhere of who's where in all these 150,000 evacuated Israelis. Nobody even knows who is staying where, which community is in which hotel. From Eilat to Netanya, nobody knows who's where. There's no list. There's been chaos, paralysis and chaos. And yes, Netanyahu did bring Benny Gantz, the centrist, and his party into what they call the national emergency government. It's not really a unity government because only Benny Gantz's party, it's not all the opposition that went in. And Lapid's the main leader of the opposition, he stayed out. But that was intended to make Israelis feel that there are some adults in the room who, have got the nation's interest at heart. Because, many of the ministries were just given out to people who are not competent or qualified to run them. And at a time like this, of a huge national emergency, they're just not working. So that's why. Sorry.
Yeah. No, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I remember, in the 90s, you covered Palestinian affairs for the Jerusalem Report and Arab affairs. And, I remember I've been thinking about something that happened when I was in Gaza in 2010, and I was interviewing somebody, and she said, "Did you see what happened in Akko?" This is a Palestinian woman in Gaza. I said, "No, what happened in Akko in Israel?" She said, this man murdered his wife in a stairwell. And I've been thinking about this anecdote because I said, wow, this woman in Gaza is monitoring so closely internal affairs inside Israel. And from my perspective, the whole country of Israel has been post-Palestinian for more than the last decade. You mentioned the elections. The biggest issue in the 2015 election was the price of cottage cheese, right? And inflation and things like that. And so when you say that this has been a shock and this has been surprising, is part of that because there's been so little coverage of what's going on with Hamas and Fatah and the Palestinians, and everybody's post-Palestinian in Israel, it seems like. No one wants to deal with it.
You could argue, that the whole security establishment was post-Palestinian. How did they not see this coming? The focus has been on when's the next war with Hezbollah going to be, what's with Iran, and Gaza and the West Bank was just kind of conflict management, and containment at best. But I think there was also a concept. I mean, we're harking back to the notion of 1973 here with the conceptia.
Concepcia,
And actually before this happened on October the 7th, the whole country was obsessed with, going over the trauma of 1973 because it was the 50th anniversary and the country had still not healed from that trauma. And I think for most Israelis, and including the government and including the military, after the last major conflict, major-ish, nothing compared to what we're in now, but of 2021, there was a concept which was that Hamas can be induced through economic incentive to become a more responsible governing party. There was a notion that that's what Hamas wanted, and that's where Hamas was headed. Israel started issuing work permits for the first time since Hamas took control of the Strip in 2007 for workers from Gaza to come into Israel on a daily basis and earn a decent wage, certainly compared to what they could earn if they could get work in Gaza. And we were up to somewhere like 18,500 workers with permits who were coming in every day. The last two rounds of fighting, as I mentioned earlier, were against Islamic Jihad, and Hamas didn't join in. And this bought into this concept that, well, if enough Qatari money goes in and, Hamas is more concerned about work permits and the economic benefits of that, then, that's good. Maybe we'll talk about another 1,000 work permits next month. That's where Israel was. And it now turns out that on Hamas's part, that was actually just a massive deception. All along that they were planning this. So yeah, I mean, in a way it was post-Palestinian. In another way, it was just a totally misguided notion of reality. And yes, most Israelis are not interested in what's happening over the lines. We've had a year of increasing tensions in the West Bank. So if anything, people were focused on that. We had a lot of terrorism within the West Bank and also within Israel, an increase in terrorist attacks. We had the army going into Janine for an operation in the summer, the likes of which we hadn't really seen since the Second Intifada, using airstrikes in the West Bank in a very pinpoint way, but still something we hadn't seen in 2 decades. We saw radical extremist settler youths rampaging through Huara and other Palestinian towns to avenge terror attacks and burning down Palestinian homes. And if anything, people were more focused on that. So yes, I mean, the what was simmering in Gaza was just not on anybody's agenda, frankly.
Isabel, one of the other things that's been striking, and not in a good way, after all the suicide bombings of the 90s, it's Sbarro, Bus 18, Cafe Moment that we lived through in Jerusalem, I don't remember people around the world coming out and cheering that as a legitimate form of resistance to the Israeli occupation. Whereas now, when you've had the worst set of massacres in Israeli history, in Jewish history since the Holocaust, this is what's happening. And what are the things that's happening on campuses, including my own, is this idea that Israel is a settler, colonial, apartheid, occupying power, and this is a form of resistance. Can you comment on this this idea that is sweeping not only American university campuses, but globally right now, and that difference between now and the 90s and why you think it is?
I think, yeah, there's been a huge shift on many levels. So yes, Israel had shifted to the right, and we had a government here for the last year that, you know, had annexation of the West Bank nominally on its agenda. And that fed into the accusations that, yes, there you see, Israel is an apartheid state, or at least there's an apartheid system in the West Bank that Israel wants to perpetuate. And this is not a temporary occupation, and Israel has no intention of you know, resolving that conflict territorially. Even though, you know, not long before we had the Trump plan, where, you know, even then there was discussion of some kind of an inadequate one, but some kind of two-state solution. And there's also been shifts on the Palestinian side. So we have a huge split, you know, that happened after the Second Intifada, where the West Bank, you know, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank just became increasingly ineffectual, weak, corrupt in the eyes of most Palestinians there, according to the polls. Hamas was seen as a sort of clean alternative and won legislative elections, Palestinian elections in 2006. A year later, factional fighting in Gaza, Hamas throws out the PA, the Palestinian Authority, routs it completely, and takes over the Gaza Strip. Also in 2006, Hamas, in a cross-border raid, kidnaps Gilad Shalit, an Israeli soldier. You know, now we have 250 or 40 captives in Gaza. You know, when you think back to the trauma that caused, one soldier who was known to be taken alive into Gaza, and the whole country for 5 years campaigned for his release. And, you know, in the end, he was released in a very lopsided prisoner exchange. But, you know, what we saw was Gaza increasingly being what the Israeli government termed as a hostile territory, abducting a soldier, arming itself. 20 years already, we've had Hamas rockets coming over into Israel. I think the first rockets to hit Sderot were 21 or 22 years ago. And increasingly, you know, this complete split between the West Bank and Gaza, which served the purpose to a degree of the Israeli camp that does not want a resolution to the conflict, because, you know, you divide and rule, and what's the point of coming to an agreement with the PA when Gaza is in the hands of Hamas? So there was, on the right, certainly a policy of weakening the PA even more to make sure that remained the situation. And the Palestinian polity itself totally split and not in any position to have any serious negotiation or concessions in a negotiation with Israel. So the last peace talks we had were 2014, and they ended with nothing. You know, there was some kind of framework proposal under John Kerry, and Abbas, they just didn't get back to him on it. And, you know, that was the end of that. So, yeah, there's been shifts on both sides that I think have played into the fact that there's no hope, really. There's no political solution realistically on the horizon. And, you know, you had the left becoming increasingly more radical and the right becoming increasingly more radical. And this is where we are. I know that there are Israeli leftists who have spent their lives here fighting for Palestinian rights and against Israeli violations of Palestinian rights, who are now speechless and horrified by what is happening with their former leftist allies abroad. You know, to not be able to condemn a massacre, the likes of which we saw on October the 7th, and even to celebrate it as resistance, legitimate resistance, when we're talking about families who were tortured and killed, babies who were killed, piles of burnt bodies, women who were brutalized and raped. I mean, these are all, you know, eyewitness reported from first responders. These aren't rumors. These are
well, and
things
also
that
Hamas broadcasted themselves on the Telegram
they
channel.
filmed themselves. They filmed themselves chopping people's heads off. And I mean, you know, I mean, for people to justify that, to be okay with that, I don't think there's anybody in Israel that can get on board with that. There are people in Israel. I mean, empathy here for the Palestinian side is probably not at its highest level right now for many Israelis. Nevertheless, there are many Israelis who will say to you, you know, we believed in peace. We thought we could have a hudna, a long-term accommodation or truce with Hamas. And we feel for the innocent civilians in Gaza who are being killed in massive numbers and who are victims of Hamas too, in many ways. And you know, many of these people are the people that were living along the Gaza border in these very liberal left kibbutzim, who had friendships going back to the days before the border was closed, with Gazans who would come and work with them in the fields. So, you know, it's become topsy-turvy for the Israeli left. And yeah, I mean, it's quite horrendous to watch from here, with all the trauma of October the 7th and the fact that we immediately went into this war of no choice, and are now embroiled in what was Israel's worst nightmare of a ground invasion in Gaza, with Hamas militants popping out of tunnels. And I mean, this is something that, you know, Israelis have dreaded the idea of for many years. And yet, you know, we kind of look on our TV screens at what's happening in London and on the streets in the States, and we kind of feel like maybe this still is the safest place to be right now. Ironically, you know, I speak to my friends in London who are, you know, suddenly their kids' soccer team, they couldn't have a game last week because the parents of the other team refused to have them play because of with the Jewish team. You know, it's and you know, one other point I would like to make, which to credit Goodman, who makes this point all the time, Israel's war now is with Hamas. It's not with the Palestinians. Israel is not fighting the Palestinians. This is about Hamas. And I think the Israeli government has tried to convey this by trying to kind of rebrand Hamas by calling it Hamas ISIS. You know, Hamas is Daesh, Hamas is ISIS. And some people see that as a kind of propaganda point. But I feel it's not. I feel it's Israel trying to convey to the world that this is not the Hamas we thought we knew. You know, raping and torturing and beheading. This is not the Hamas Israel knew. This is not what Israel thought Hamas was. This is something else. And you hear this from the leaders here all the time. This is something else. And this war is something else. This is not just another round of fighting, the likes of which we see once or twice a year with Gaza. This is
But
something
Isabel, at the
else.
same time, it's like, and I'm going to come to Professor Hasner for a little bit in a moment, but on this point, the world right now is not saying we need Hamas to get out of Gaza. They need to surrender and get out, right? They are saying, Israel, you need to stop. You need a ceasefire. There are 8,000 Palestinian dead right now. Why do you think that that is not the way it's going? Like, why are people not seeing Hamas? That talking point does not seem to be taking hold very, very widely.
Look, I mean, the death toll, obviously, and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, I think, shortens the space Israel has and the international legitimacy Israel has. So yes, in the first few days after October the 7th, generally there was a feeling of, yes, of course, Israel has to respond, Israel has to fight, Israel has to, and it was almost seen as, yes, retaliation there has to be some kind of retaliation. But for Israel, this isn't about retaliation and revenge. For Israel now, this is we Israelis cannot live with that on our doorstep, and therefore Hamas has to be dismantled, and the threat of a militarized Hamas has to be gone. And Israel has set a goal for its military offensive of taking down Hamas's military capabilities and its ability to govern. Now, how do you do away with Hamas? Hamas is an idea. Hamas is, millions of people. I mean, how do you do away with Hamas? Nobody really knows what that means right now. Nobody knows how long Israel will be able to continue with this fight and maintain enough international support for it. It's because Gaza is a crowded place, and because Hamas operates from within the civilian areas of Gaza, you cannot have a military campaign there that doesn't result in huge losses, civilian losses, and that it's inevitable. But I think for now the feeling in Israel is that this is a just war, this is a necessary war, and we cannot, if we just say, okay, let's have a ceasefire now and go back to how we were and carry on. That's not where people here are at now.
Isabel, let me pause for a moment here. We're going to bring in somewhat differently than past webinars here. We're going to bring in Professor Hasner here. He has two students who are going to ask questions, and then I'm going to come back to you with some questions about the media coverage of the conflict.
Yeah, thank you both. Can you hear us well?
Yes, I can.
Great. So we are gathered here in a seminar room at UC Berkeley. This is an Israel Studies seminar. There are about a dozen of us around the table, and two of us have prepared questions ahead of time. Haley, you want to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Yes, nice to meet you, and thank you for having us. My name is Haley Bartow. I'm a student of Professor Ron Hasner. My question sort of speaks that while it is not unique to the journalists covering the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the conflict between Israel and Hamas, it does seem that there has been a trend of journalists covering this topic being labeled as actors or fakes on social media, possibly fueling already high tensions that we've seen erupt on this very key.
So it looks like we may have lost them
We lost the connection there.
They're back now. Go ahead.
Oh, hi. I'm sorry, we lost you. So if you could just repeat the question, sorry.
Ron, unmute yourself there.
Okay, let's try that again.
Okay.
Okay.
So while it is not unique to journalists covering this situation, I do feel that the journalists covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the conflict between Israel and Hamas, it does seem that there has been an increasing trend of journalists covering this topic being labeled as actors or fakes, also with edited videos being disseminated on social media. And that has possibly led to fueled tensions.
We lost them again.
Yeah, okay. So I think there's a problem there, Rebecca, with the audio in the room. So maybe they can put their questions in the chat or something like that. Isabel, just to pick up on what the student was saying, I mean, she was asking, I think, about the role of, social media in this disinformation. But if we could go beyond that and just, trying to counter some of the fakes and people sorting through it and the quickness of a TikTok video with the actual difficulties of reporting in Gaza right now. Okay. Like I have top editors reaching out to me for guidance on, do we trust the Gaza Health Ministry numbers on this? Or, they run by Hamas. I mean, should we trust the ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross, or there's nobody on the ground? So like, how do you deal with this as the New York Times?
Well, reporting from Gaza now is a huge challenge. Not only are people in Gaza, journalists there, in great danger, and in many cases have moved south and are not in their normal work environment. Many have lost a lot of family members in the last 3 weeks. It's a huge challenge for journalists on the ground, and nobody else can get into Gaza. So, we have people working from outside Gaza with people in Gaza, and trying to, as best as possible, bring the voices from there, but without physically being there. Then there are communications issues when, at times the communications are down or taken down as part of the fog of war. And yes, I mean, it's very, very challenging. I mean, I think, if you ask, do we go with the Gaza Health Ministry numbers? Yes, we do, because there's no other numbers. But we do try and point out that, this is a ministry in Hamas-run Gaza. I think the numbers are generally, or have generally in the past been proven to be, within the ballpark. Nobody's found hugely inflated numbers of the dead in the past, in conflicts in the past. But what you don't know from the Gaza ministry figures is how many of those people are actually combatants. Obviously, if you count the women and children under the age of 16, then, highly unlikely that they're going to be combatants. But once you look at the males over that age, there's no way of discerning how many of these people are civilians, how many might be combatants, except for obviously much older people. And, the numbers are just, we're beyond the times where in the past, Al-Qassam or the militant groups there would put out, the names of each of their martyrs, as it were, or people who'd been killed in combat. So, you have some rough idea, but you're kind of groping in the dark some of the time. I think that, there is a huge challenge with video and images, and I know at the Times they make a lot of effort to verify in any way we can what's being used. If we can't verify it, we say so. We say this information could not be independently verified, or we would try not to use video or pictures that we can't vouch for through whether it's timestamp, geolocation, whatever. Visually, I think this conflict is not so different from others in that the images that come out of Gaza are just naturally so much more dramatic than the images that come out of Israel. I mean, you have neighborhoods flattened, pictures from the morgue, and in Israel, images of people in their shelters because the sirens are going off, it doesn't compare. And with the atrocities that happened on October the 7th, Israel is kind of, there's an ethos here of respect for the dead and respect for the families of the dead. So you don't really get so many gory pictures coming out of Israel for public consumption. That means that in many cases, people are suspicious of whether these things really happened because they haven't seen the evidence. And just describing and saying, this is what this person saw, or I have seen these pictures, goes only some way to being able to convey the horrors that happened here on October the 7th. I mean, yes, you can show burnt houses, you can show funerals, but visually there's always an imbalance.
Well, towards that end, I know the Prime Minister's office or the Foreign Ministry, put together that 42-minute montage of some of the horror, and even that was, I think, sanitized to a certain extent to try and convey it. Yeah, I mean, we know how much worse, but there's a lot of questions here, Isabel. I've given many talks on this, and there's a lot of accusations about bias and one way or the other, and people canceling their New York Times subscriptions because they feel it's biased against Israel or towards Israel or whatever. And a lot of people are focused on the incident of the bombing of, the rocket attack at the hospital, which turned out to be a rocket attack, and the pressure, I guess, the Times felt to go out initially. And I know this is a decision made in New York. About, okay, well, we've got it from Palestinian sources that this was an Israeli attack, and then it now has been confirmed, I believe, to be a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket misfire, and then the New York Times had to write a sort of an explainer of, and I don't know if it was a correction per se, but more of a clarification of what happened. Can you talk about this rush and how the Times wrestles with these kinds of conflicting narratives about an incident?
Yeah, well, what happened that night was, generally since this crisis began, we've moved into live coverage. Now it's not enough to be digital. Now, when there's breaking news or a big moving news story, we run a live blog. And the live blog has now been going for 3.5 weeks. That in itself is quite a draining endeavor. That night, the first reports that came through of this attack, seeming attack on the hospital, it was one Palestinian official in Gaza, I believe a health official, who said, yes, it was an Israeli strike and 500 people have been killed. That was all there was to go on at the time. I think early on, the military was urging caution, but they took their time to come out with any credible pushback, saying actually our initial investigation shows it wasn't us, it wasn't the Israeli military. It took a few hours, and I think part of the reason for that was that the army spokespeople's unit got very badly burned in the affair of the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, the American Palestinian journalist for Al Jazeera, because very quickly that day, the military came out and said, we believe that she was killed by Palestinian fire, and not us. And it turned out not to be true. And their credibility took a big blow. And this time they wanted to be credible. So they took their time. They did urge caution, but they took their time coming out with a proper statement saying our initial investigation shows or suggests that this was actually a misfire of a Palestinian rocket that didn't hit the hospital at all. The hospital wasn't damaged. It hit the parking lot, and created a massive fire, because the army concluded because of the propellant, the rocket hadn't gone very far, and therefore it was full of very flammable propellant. I think what happened at the Times that night, I mean, I'm, just going on what Joe Kahn explained in that editor's note, and then later in an audio podcast, the reporters were reporting what they had at the time, but somebody made a decision to turn this into a banner headline and to send out an alert. And that shouldn't have happened, not based on what was known at the time, not based on the sourcing that was available at the time. There should have been obviously much more caution. And lessons are being learned. I mean, conclusions were drawn, and, it was a mistake. It was very damaging. You saw protests erupting around the Arab world because of this. And once that version was out there, people watching certainly the Arabic media were not going to change their minds. It doesn't matter what Israel says 5 hours later or the next morning, or what the Pentagon then says, or what France and Canada and the UK says. That narrative was set. An Israeli strike hit the hospital.
What's interesting about it to me is that there's so much discussion right now about people are getting their news on TikTok through these videos and through, the dueling social media narratives. But at the end of the day, a banner headline in the New York Times that it's erroneous has an impact. It's still, the most
and
important
the Times is aware of that. I mean, it was more than a correction or a clarification. It was an editor's note. It took some time, but the New York Times has acknowledged that it did not perform in that case as it should have, and lessons will be learned.
So maybe going forward, I mean, it's so, but I think what I want, what's clear is that, and maybe not as clear to people watching this webinar, is just when you're dealing with this kind of a situation in real time, it's not an excuse, but the pressure to go out there, the different teams within the New York Times, like if some editor puts out a headline like that, it doesn't have to, they're not calling Isabel Kershner to be like, are you okay with this headline, right? So it's a complicated beast. There's a couple questions from Professor Hausner's students about the role of journalists. I guess one from Renee in sort of shaping the outcome of the war. I don't really think about it in terms of shaping an outcome, but in general, at this critical moment, how do you see the role of the journalists on the ground in interpreting it in to the world?
I think it's at times like this where you realize the importance of the mission of being, of responsible journalism. Yes, there are social networks. Yes, there's TikTok. Yes, there's citizen journalists. Yes, everything else. But, this is a time for sober, responsible journalism. And I think a lot of people around the world rely on that. And yes, that's why that banner headline was so damaging. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that it's within our power as journalists to shape the outcome of a war, but it is our responsibility to bear witness as much as possible, to responsibly report factually, with context, with balance, as much as we can, what is happening, to interpret for people why this is happening. And it's a huge task. And because we're now in the age of digital, instant, 24-hour journalism, it's almost a contradiction in terms, being careful and responsible, and yet having to be instant. And it really is a challenge. There are a lot of hands on this story now. This has gone way beyond anything that our usual team of Israeli and Palestinian and Arabic speaking correspondents could deal with. So, we have a lot of hands on this story. It's, not I don't even know some of the people that, I'm now working with for hours on end at the other end of your editing process. It's massive, and it's going to go on for a time, and it's going to take stamina. It's going to take a lot of patience on all sides. But I just to get back to the question, I don't think it's within our power to shape the outcome. But yes, I do think it is our responsibility to at least allow people to, as far as possible, understand where this is coming from, why it's happening, and what is happening.
One of the things that people get agitated about in the media coverage is sort of the way you structure the piece. Which context are you going to put first? Whose victimhood narrative are you going to center? Are you going back to 1948 or 1967 or October 7th in your second or third paragraph? And so when you sit down to write these stories, how do you think about your structuring of that and the context that you're going to center in your piece?
I think to a degree, we have to start from October 7th. That was a massive break in anything that we have known in the history of this country, in this conflict, and in recent decades. But yes, I mean, having started from that, then, that there is obviously a broad history on both sides of how we got to this point. And, whether it's because of, you can go back and back and back. So if you're looking at Gaza, you can say, yes, it's been like what people refer to often as an open air prison and a pressure cooker. Or you can say, yes, but in 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew, and it could have been different. Yes, there's a blockade on Gaza. There's been a blockade imposed by Israel and Egypt for 16 years. But yes, that blockade was imposed because Hamas was militarizing and building rockets and firing rockets at Israel. And therefore the blockade was deemed necessary to stop the military buildup there. So, you know, where do you begin and where do you end? It's, you know, often not within our the possibility of the scope of a, you know, whether it's an 800 or 10, you know, 1,000 or 1,100 word article to even begin to scrape the surface of these things. It's a challenge every time.
You know, people are still coming back to the scale of what's happening in Gaza right now. And I know you're seeing, just for a reporter's notebook sort of question now, you've got now American ships coming in, it looks like, maybe to evacuate some people. Finally, Rafah is open to a few hundred, I think, foreign passport holders there. Do you see anything else happening to sort of help spare the number of civilian casualties there, either through a humanitarian corridor through Egypt, evacuating more people as Israel pursues, as you described, the war to dislodge Hamas there?
Well, in the immediate term, it seems that Israel has committed to the Americans that it will allow a lot more humanitarian aid into southern Gaza. So if we saw last week, you know, a trickle of trucks going in with food and medicine and water, that number is going to increase this week. You know, it's supposed to be up to 100 a day. Israel is using that humanitarian aid to say, you know, move to the south, to the remaining few 100,000 civilians who are still in the north and in Gaza City. Israel saying move south where it's safer, not 100% safe, but safer. And there you will find more humanitarian assistance. But conditions in the south are very, very difficult. You know, people are in tent cities. The conditions are awful. And a lot of people say we'd prefer to just die in our homes, or we don't have anywhere to go, or it's not safe to move, or we don't have any means of getting south now. It's really an impossible situation. The whole question of should there be a corridor out to Egypt, into the Sinai, is extremely controversial because Palestinians in Gaza, you know, 2/3 or more of the population of Gaza are refugees or their descendants from 1948. And so the echoes of the Nakba, of becoming a refugee again and not being able to come back is a very real fear for many Palestinian Gazans. And Egypt has said, no, we're not going to open our border for, you know, temporary refuge in the Sinai. If Israel wants to give temporary refuge, let them do it in the Negev desert. So I'm not sure we're going to see that. It's a terrible situation. But you know, I at the same time, you know, the whole situation that Israel has found itself in, you know, we can't forget this is a war that Israel wasn't seeking, it wasn't prepared for, and it is not a war that Israel chose. You know, it's just a terrible situation all around, and furthermore, we don't really know how it ends.
No, we don't. And my one regret in this conversation, which unfortunately we have to wrap, Isabel, is that I didn't get to sing your praises enough about your book, and just how essential reading it is for people who want to understand sort of who are the people of Israel right now, where they came from. You know, Zionism is on the tip of everybody's tongue right now, and the way you, through this cast of characters, go back to the early period of the Yishuv and the debates around 1948 of what happened within Israel itself, It's really invaluable reading. And I mean, these characters, the Moshavnik Asaf and Nachmias and all these people, it's really spectacular. So I want to thank you for joining us and for giving your perspectives on this incredibly difficult time and for all your hard work. And now I'm going to turn back to our host, Rebecca Goldberg.
Thank you,
Thank
Janine.
you. I'd just like to thank you all so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank you both. I want to thank Janine for moderating this conversation masterfully. It's amazing to have you as an asset here in the Bay Area. And thank you, Isabel, for stepping away from your critical work to be with us today, for your honest and forthright responses, sometimes personal and emotional, and for giving us insight into what you've witnessed as a correspondent on the ground, covering these unprecedented moments in Israeli history and society. And I want to note that we do hope that at some point we'll be able to continue this conversation in person when you are able to visit the Bay Area. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.